The gavel struck, and the sound cut through the silence of the courtroom. My stomach clenched as if the blow had landed on me instead of the wood. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands locked together so tight the knuckles had gone white. Across from me sat Diana. My wife of 25 years, the woman I once believed I would grow old, with her chin lifted and her eyes sharp as a blade. She wore her favorite dark suit, hair swept back, not a strand out of place, her expression unreadable to everyone except me. I knew that look. It was the same look she wore when she closed on $1 million deal. It was the look of victory. The judge cleared her throat and shuffled the papers in front of her. My attorney, Rebecca Sloan, leaned toward me and whispered to keep calm. I wanted to laugh. Calm was not possible when your entire life was being dismantled piece by piece. Diana's attorney had just presented a series of documents to the court. Bank statements showing withdrawals I had never made. Casino receipts stamped with my name and signature that did not belong to me. A sworn affidavit from my neighbor Frank Doyle claiming he had seen me gambling online during the late hours. Lies stacked on top of lies, and yet the papers carried more weight than the truth spilling from my mouth. I could feel sweat roll down my back under the starched shirt I had worn. The air was heavy with judgment. Olivia sat on the bench behind her mother, her legs crossed, notebook in hand. My daughter, 21, first-year law student at the University of Texas. She watched everything with sharp eyes, lips pressed tight. When she looked at me, there was no warmth, only doubt. Jacob sat next to her, broad-shouldered from football, just 17, still a boy in so many ways. He could not hold my gaze. His eyes stayed glued to the floor, fists clenching on his knees. The sight of my children turning away was a pain no bullet had ever given me. I tried to speak. The words came harsh, raw, but I forced them out. Your Honor, I never set foot in those casinos. Those bank statements are fabricated. I was a detective in Austin for 20 years. I know what evidence should look like. This is staged. The judge's eyes did not soften. She had heard every plea in every case, and my words slid off like rain on glass. Rebecca stood arguing that the timing of the withdrawals was impossible, that my work records placed me at the police department during those hours. She pointed out inconsistencies in Frank Doyle's affidavit. The man had once borrowed tools from me and never returned them. We had not spoken for years. Now he sat in the courtroom, avoiding my stare, pretending to adjust his tie. Diana's attorney countered smoothly, reminding the court that addiction hides in shadows, that liars are skilled at disguising their weakness. I wanted to slam the table and shout that the only liar in the room was Diana, but I stayed silent. Years of training as a cop taught me control even when fire burned in my chest. The judge leaned forward, her voice steady. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds that custody of the minor child Jacob Mercer is granted to Diana Mercer. Full ownership of the marital home is granted to Diana Mercer. Financial assets, including retirement accounts, are transferred to her as well. I froze. Each word was another strike. My home gone. My savings gone. My son stripped from me. The American dream I built collapsed into dust with the swing of a gavel. I glanced toward Olivia. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes flickered for a second with something like pity. Jacob still refused to look up, and then Diana turned her head ever so slightly toward me. She smiled. Not the smile that once warmed me when we lay in bed planning vacations or when she kissed our newborn daughter. This was a smile carved out of ice. She leaned closer as if adjusting her papers, and her voice reached me like a whisper from hell. You will never see them again. The words pierced deeper than any knife. My heart hammered. For a moment I could not breathe. The courtroom around me blurred, voices echoing as if far away. The judge continued with final instructions. Rebecca gathered her papers, but I heard none of it. All I saw was Diana's cold satisfaction. She had destroyed me completely and enjoyed every second. When the session ended, people shuffled out. I remained seated, staring at the grain of the wooden table, as if answers were hidden in its scars. Rebecca placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice low. "We will appeal, Jonathan. We will fight this." I nodded, though my body felt hollow. My training had prepared me for crime scenes, interrogations, the sight of blood and betrayal on the streets. Nothing had prepared me for the betrayal at home delivered by the woman I had trusted with my life. I finally stood, legs unsteady. The bailiff opened the doors, and the crowd spilled into the hallway. Diana walked past me, heels striking the floor in sharp rhythm. Olivia followed close behind, carrying her mother's files, glancing at me once with conflict in her eyes. Jacob trailed, his shoulders hunched, the weight of confusion heavy on him. None of them paused. None of them reached out. They vanished down the hall, as if I was already gone from their lives. Rebecca gathered her bag and looked at me firmly. "Jonathan, you need to go home, clear your head. Then we prepare for what comes next." I nodded again, but I knew. Home no longer existed. The house was hers. The children were hers. All I had left was the echo of Diana's whisper burning inside my ears. I walked out into the parking lot, the sun blinding, the heat of Texas pressing against my skin. My car sat where I had left it, old and dented, a reminder of how far I had fallen. I slid into the driver's seat, gripped the wheel, and closed my eyes. The words repeated themselves in my mind over and over like a curse I could not shake. "You will never see them again." I started the engine, the roar filling the silence. I had been a detective long enough to know when a story did not add up, when a puzzle piece had been forced into the wrong place. Something about all this reeked of design, of manipulation. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The court had spoken. My children were gone. My home was gone. And as I pulled out of the lot, I felt the weight of a man stripped of everything that once defined him. I took the long way out of downtown, letting the traffic on Cesar Chavez swallow me, while the sun hammered the windshield. I turned south on the bridge over the lake and watched kayaks drift under me like slow-moving bones. Years ago, I used to bring the kids here on Sunday mornings. Olivia loved the quiet. Jacob loved the dogs that trotted by with their tongues hanging out. Diana would laugh when Jacob tried to race the joggers. I pulled into a diner that looked the same as it had 20 years ago. I sat at the counter and wrapped my hands around the mug, more for the heat than the caffeine. The first crack in our marriage was small enough to ignore. A forgotten dinner reservation. A client emergency that seemed urgent in the moment and unimportant the next morning. She would apologize and promise to make it up to me. I would wave it off because I understood pressure. I had spent 2 decades lying on stakeouts, eating stale pretzels and waiting for men who hurt other people. The second crack came with a sheen of success. Diana moved from starter homes to glass and steel. Meridian Lux Realty put her face on a billboard near the highway. She said the market was exploding and this was her moment. I believed her because I had always believed in her. I took on extra chores without keeping score. I packed lunches. I ironed shirts. My instincts twitched in ways I did not want to name. My job had taught me to notice small things. The way a suspect shifts his weight. The way a story changes over time. I noticed new passwords. I noticed the phone turned face down on the counter, not the way she used to leave it with the weather app open. I noticed the new habit of stepping outside to take calls even when the evening was cold enough to see breath. One night I came home after a double shift. The house smelled faintly of her perfume, and the citrus cleaner she loved. The clock said 1:30. The master bedroom light was off, but a thin ribbon of light leaked under the bathroom door. When she came out, her face looked washed empty. She said a client had a panic attack over a financing contingency, and she had spent the evening calming them down. I told her it was fine, and that we could talk tomorrow. She slid into bed facing away from me, and breathed as if she had been running. There was a day in late spring that burns in me now like a brand. I had taken the afternoon off because Jacob's team made the playoffs, and I wanted to surprise him with a new pair of cleats. I stopped by the sporting goods store, then turned down our street box on the passenger seat, feeling light for the first time in weeks. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Diana's car in the garage. The engine was off. I cut my engine and stepped out. The air inside the garage was still hot and close. Diana sat in the driver's seat with her head bowed. In her hand was a phone I had never seen. Not the sleek silver iPhone she used for everything, but a small black device, no case, no charm, the kind sold at convenience stores for cash. She spoke into it in a whisper too low for words, but not too low for tone. The tone was the kind people use when they are afraid of being overheard. She looked up and saw me. For a fraction of a second, panic showed on her face, bare and raw. Her fingers closed around the phone and slid it into her bag with a motion so quick it could have been rehearsed. Then he was out of the car, smile painted on voice bright. She said she had been on hold with a lender and her regular phone was dead. She said she would explain everything later. I lifted the cleats from the box, held them up, and told her Jacob was going to love them. She nodded and said he would flip. We walked inside. We put on a show of normal, and for a while it worked. I sat in the car and stared at the steering wheel, waiting for the memory to loosen its grip. It did not. The image of that small black phone hung in front of me like a warning flare. I had bought them from evidence lockers and watched criminals fumble with them in holding cells. I told myself it could still be nothing. I told myself a lot of things to keep the peace. I drove past our old street, but did not turn in. The house was no longer mine, and the thought of seeing her car in the drive made my stomach twist. I headed toward the north side, toward the one bedroom I had rented, when the fighting began to bruise the walls. I parked under a mesquite tree that dripped sap on the hood and climbed the stairs with the weight of a man who had worn a vest too long. Inside, the air was stale. I set my keys on the counter, and the sound echoed in the small space. There was a couch I had found at a thrift store, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed that still felt like a guest room, even though I had been sleeping in it for months. On the fridge was a picture Jacob had drawn when he was 8. A football tucked under his arm, a smile wide as Texas. I touched the paper and felt the soft give of worn edges. I stood at the sink and ran the water until it turned cold. I splashed my face and watched the drops slide into the basin. The afternoon drained into evening. The light outside shifted from gold to the color of old pennies. Somewhere a television murmured. Somewhere a neighbor laughed. My phone buzzed on the counter, and the screen lit up with a number I did not recognize. I let it glow until it dimmed. I did not have the strength to invite more words into the room. I pulled a chair to the window and sat with my back against the wall, legs stretched, palms pressed to my knees. I thought about the early years. Diana and I eating tacos on the tailgate of my truck after a late shift. Diana sleeping on my shoulder while a baseball game mumbled from a radio. The way she used to reach for my hand without looking. I tried to find the exact moment we had moved from that to burner phones and whispered calls. I could not. It is never one moment. It is a drip that becomes a flood. The sky turned purple. Streetlights clicked on with a small electric pop. I told myself I would rest, and then I would start putting the pieces together. Not as a husband pleading for mercy, but as a detective who had ignored the evidence in his own house. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. The last thing I saw before the dark took me was the shape of that small black phone in her hand, and the flash of fear in her eyes when she realized I had seen it. I woke to the sound of a lawnmower outside, and for a moment I forgot where I was. The ceiling above me was cracked with a water stain shaped like a crooked arrow. The air conditioner rattled weakly in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the Texas heat. I sat up on the thrift store couch, clothes still on, mouth dry, head heavy. This was not home. It was never meant to be home. It was a holding cell without bars. 2 suitcases leaned against the wall near the door. They held what was left of my life after the court stripped me bare. A few shirts, my old service revolver locked in a box, a stack of family photos I could not leave behind. I pulled one out now. A framed picture from Galveston, the 4 of us standing in front of the surf. Olivia in sunglasses too big for her face, Jacob with a sandcastle bucket in his hand. Diana leaning into me, smiling as if nothing could ever touch us. I traced the glass with my thumb. That smile had been a lie, or maybe it had just died before I noticed. My phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it like a drowning man grabs a rope. It was an email from Olivia. Short. Cold. If you really did nothing wrong, then why is there so much evidence? I stared at the words until they blurred. This was my daughter, the girl who used to sit on my lap with her toy gavel, pretending to judge me guilty of stealing cookies. Now she looked at me like the criminal Diana painted in court. My fingers hovered over the keys, desperate to explain, but what could I write? The truth. That the evidence was fake. That her mother was lying. She would only see a man protesting too much. I closed the phone without replying. A minute later, another buzz. This time, a text from Jacob. Dad, I don't know who to believe. That was all. 7 words from my son, the boy who used to run across the yard yelling my name like it was a victory chant. I tried to picture his face when he typed it. Confused. Angry. Scared. Whatever it was, it broke something inside me. The court had taken my house and my money, but losing my children's trust was the real execution. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat at the table staring at the thin curtains that barely blocked the morning light. The complex outside was already buzzing. Kids ran past, a dog barked, someone cursed at a stalled engine. I had once been respected. Neighbors used to nod and call me Detective Mercer. Now I was just another divorced man in a cheap apartment. I left the mug half full and walked out. The stairwell smelled of cigarettes and fried food. As I reached the lot, I caught voices behind me. A man and a woman talking low, but not low enough. That's him, the one who got fired for skimming evidence money. Heard he had gambling debts up to his ears. I froze mid-step. My heart slammed once hard. They were repeating the same story Diana's attorney had thrown in court, the same lies that had shredded me. I turned my head and saw 2 tenants by the mailboxes staring at me like I was a headline. I wanted to shout to demand they tell me where they heard it, but the look in their eyes said it would not matter. Once a rumor sticks, truth cannot wash it off. I walked on shoulders tight, jaw locked. My reputation had been my badge, and now it was dirt for strangers to kick. I kept moving until I reached the street. Cars rushed past, horns blaring. I leaned against a lamppost and tried to breathe. Anger clawed at me, but underneath was shame, the kind that makes you want to disappear. I knew better than anyone how lies spread. I had seen men destroyed by whispers before evidence ever reached a courtroom. Now I was the one rotting under the weight of invented sins. Later that afternoon, I stopped by a small store for groceries. I grabbed bread, milk, eggs. At the counter, the cashier, a kid with acne scars, glanced at me, and then at the tabloids by the register. A headline screamed, "Former detective caught in gambling scandal." The photo was grainy, pulled from a file somewhere, but it was me. My stomach twisted. Even the checkout line was an ambush. I paid cash and left fast, but the world felt smaller. Everyone seemed to look too long, whisper too quickly. Back at the apartment, I set the bag down and sat heavy on the couch. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail. I pressed play and heard Frank Doyle's voice. "Jonathan, sorry about all this. You know how lawyers are. They needed someone to testify. I just told them what I saw." His tone was casual, almost friendly, like we were still neighbors swapping beer over the fence. My blood boiled. Frank had been in my yard 100 times, drinking my beer, watching football with me, calling me brother. Now he was the knife in my back, paid or persuaded, I did not know which. I deleted the message before he could say another word. I sat in silence until the light outside dimmed. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of dust and old carpet. I stared at the photograph on the counter again, the four of us frozen in a moment that no longer existed. Diana, smiling, children laughing, me standing tall with my arm around them. I wanted to step back into that picture and live there forever, before the cracks, before the burner phone, before the court. But photographs are just lies pressed into paper. They show you what you want to believe, not what is. The night came down quiet. I locked the door and turned off the light, the apartment falling into shadow. I stretched out on the couch and closed my eyes. Voices from earlier still rang in my head. Fired for corruption. Gambling addict. Skimming money. Lies I had never imagined attached to my name. They pressed down on me until the air felt thin. I clenched my fists and swore under my breath. They had taken my home, my children, my reputation. All I had left was the truth, and somehow even that sounded like a lie to everyone else. I lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere outside, a car backfired. Somewhere, a couple laughed too loud. I stared at the ceiling and felt the walls of my life closing in. I thought about Diana's whisper in the courtroom. "You will never see them again." For the first time, I believed she might be right. I packed before the sun came up and drove east with the radio low and the windows cracked just enough to let the hot air move. By the time I reached the old block in Old Brooklyn, the light had settled into the soft gold of early morning. The maple trees along the curb made a tunnel of shade over the street. The house waited where it had always been, a small brick bungalow with white trim and a porch that creaked in the same place it always had. I killed the engine and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The air carried a trace of the lake, a cool damp that cut through the summer. I took the key from my ring and walked up the 3 steps to the porch. Inside, the house smelled like dust and lemon oil and old paper. I stood in the living room and felt years tilt toward me. The chair where my mother used to read still faced the window, her shawl folded over the arm like she had just stepped into the kitchen. The bookshelf sagged with hardcovers from library sales. A framed photograph of me in my academy uniform sat crooked on the mantel next to a ceramic lighthouse she won at a church raffle. The tick of the kitchen clock carried into the room, and for a second I expected to hear her call my name. The kitchen counter held a glass jar of buttons, the kind she used to keep from mending. The table had one of her lists still magneted to the fridge, a grocery plan for a week that never came. Milk, eggs, tea, 2 apples. It had been 5 years, but in here time kept its own counsel. I went down the hall and opened the door to my old room. The bedspread was new, but the bones of the room were the same. Poster tack scars where baseball photos once hung. A shelf full of paperbacks with creased spines. A box on the floor marked with my handwriting from another decade. I lifted the lid and found my high school letter jacket folded under a stack of notebooks. I closed the box and sat on the edge of the bed until the rush of memories settled. In the bathroom, a small bottle of my mother's shampoo stood on the edge of the tub half full, the cap stuck with a ring of soap. I turned the tap to hear the pipes groan back to life and then shut it off. I could feel the house waking around me as if it had been holding its breath for years, and finally decided to exhale. Back in the living room, I sank into my mother's chair and laid my head back. The fabric was worn smooth by decades of her shoulders. I could see her hands in my mind, the way she would hold a book with her thumbs anchored at the margins, and a library stamp inked faintly on the pad of one finger. She had worked 30 years at the Cleveland Public Library, the Carnegie West Branch near Fulton, riding the bus, in winters so cold the air hurt. She owned 3 coats in her life, none of them expensive, and gave away every spare dollar she could find. She believed in 2 things more than anything else: work done well and the safety of a locked door. I remembered the day she spoke to me about the basement. It was a winter afternoon after my father's service. The windows were fogged. The kitchen smelled of coffee and ham and perfume from too many women hugging my shoulders. She dried a plate and told me without ceremony that the door at the bottom of the hallway was not to be opened unless I had lost everything else. She said it like an instruction for a fire drill. Firm, calm, final. At the time, I thought grief had sharpened her edges, and I nodded to ease her mind. Years later, when I became a detective and learned to respect the way people hide their strongest truths in the simplest phrases, the memory returned with new weight, and I tucked it away. Now the words came back with the clarity of an order given in a crisis. If one day you lose everything, open the basement door. I stood. The hallway stretched in front of me, narrow and dim, the kind of corridor that squeezes your breath as you walk it. The door at the end sat flush with the wall, painted the same soft white as the trim, the knob, a dull brass worn smooth by 1,000 touches that never turned it fully. I walked toward it and felt the floorboards speak under my feet. The air grew cooler. Dust hung in the light like slow rain. At the door, I reached out and laid my hand on the knob. The metal was colder than I expected. A small chain lock sat above the knob, the kind a cautious person adds after a break-in on the evening news. My mother had always been cautious. She used to check the stove 3 times before bed. She used to set the deadbolt twice and murmur the numbers under her breath to make sure she had done it. I slid the chain free and listened for any sound on the other side. On the other side of this door, there was only the quiet of a place that had not seen light in years. My hand shook and I told it to stop. Somewhere in me, the detective cataloged details without permission. The paint on the frame chipped where someone had once missed the latch. A faint scuff along the threshold where heavy boxes had been dragged. Cobwebs in the corner pulled tight as violin strings. All of it ordinary, all of it loaded now with a weight I did not understand. I tightened my grip and turned the knob a 1/4 inch. The latch clicked. A breath of cooler air slipped through the gap and brushed my wrist. I could smell concrete and cardboard, a mineral tang that pulled me back to childhood afternoons, spent hiding on the steps, while my mother sorted laundry and hummed a tune she never finished. I paused with the door open a sliver and felt my heart tap hard against my ribs. I let the knob settle back into place. Not yet. I needed light. I needed a flashlight and a clear head. I needed a moment to stand in this house and accept that I had done exactly what she had warned I might one day have to do. I had come home because I had nothing left anywhere else. I stepped back and leaned against the hallway wall. The cool plaster pressed through my shirt. I breathed in slow and let it out. In the living room, the clock ticked on steady as a metronome. Outside, a car moved past, and the sound faded. I told myself I would open the door when the sun shifted higher and the rooms lost their shadows. I would bring a light. I would bring a notebook like I always did when I entered a scene that might hold answers I was not ready to hear. I pushed off the wall and returned to the living room. The chair waited for me, and I sank into it again, palms flat on my thighs, eyes on the hallway. The door sat at the end like a held breath. I did not take my eyes off it. I sat there until the light changed, and the dust in the air turned from gold to white, and I let the stillness of the house wrap around me like a blanket I had forgotten I owned. I waited for the streetlights to glow steady outside, and then I turned off the lamp in the living room. Sleep did not come. I stood and walked the short hallway. My hand brushed the paint as I passed a habit from years of clearing rooms. At the end of the hall, I stopped and put my ear to the basement door. Back in my old room, I sat on the bed and let the past find me. My father's face rose out of the shadows with the plain light of memory. He worked construction when the weather allowed, and odd jobs when it did not. In the summer, he would come home with grit in the seams of his fingers, pour a glass of iced tea, and sit on the back steps with his boots off and his eyes closed. Then the picture shifted to the year everything broke. I was 24 and trying to decide whether to join the academy or take a job that paid faster. One night, my mother stood at the window and pulled the curtain back with 2 fingers, the way you do when you are afraid of what might be looking back. She let it fall and told me to finish my homework, even though I had not had homework in years. Weeks later, a patrol car idled outside at dawn, and 2 officers walked up the path with faces that had already learned how to be careful. They said there had been an accident on a stretch of Route 2, slick with black ice. They said he must have lost control. They said there was nothing else to say. The table filled with casseroles, ham pies, wrapped plates with names on tape. My mother moved among the dishes as if she had a list no one else could see. She did not cry the way others cried. She went quiet, and she checked the locks twice before bed. 2 weeks after the funeral, she told me to help her box up the living room. We moved to this house across town with a speed that felt like an answer to a question I had not asked. We left a few pieces of furniture behind, with the landlady as if they were contaminated. Now, standing in the silence of that house, I felt something colder take shape. It was the old feeling that visits detectives when a scene does not match the story. The top shelf held a row of shoeboxes and a dented hat box. I reached up, pulled them down, and set them on the bed. Inside the first were letters from my mother's sisters in Dayton, clipped with paper clips that left rust kisses on the corners. The second held vacation maps folded to the wrong pages. The third was heavier. When I lifted the lid, the smell of newsprint came up like a breath from the past. Inside were clippings stacked by date with rubber bands that had turned brittle and brown. The first clippings were about library fundraisers and book fairs, the kind of pieces my mother would save because they carried the names of friends. A few were about the old neighborhood school awards, a church renovation, an article on a neighbor's garden that won a city prize. I kept going until I found the year that mattered. Local man killed in early morning crash on Route 2. The story was short and careful. It said a sedan left the roadway near an exit ramp, struck a guardrail, and flipped. It said alcohol was not suspected. It said the investigation was ongoing. It said the name Michael Carter in a line that seemed too thin to hold him. I set it aside, breath shallow, and checked what came next. There were 2 follow-up articles from a week later. One said weather might have played a role. One quoted a trooper who reminded drivers to slow down during freeze-thaw cycles. None of it made noise in my head. The truth that lives under accidents is often sleeping somewhere else. I kept reading. My thumb stopped on a different headline from the same section, but a different day. Local businessman questioned in organized crime probe. The name in the second paragraph reached up and grabbed me. Salvatore Rizzo. I felt the house tilt. There in the margin, my mother had pressed a pencil hard enough to bruise the paper. She had drawn a small circle around the name, then another circle darker, then a final ring so heavy the graphite had gone silver. Her neat script ran along the edge. It said, "Ask Robert at the branch." The rest of the line trailed off. I did not know who Robert was. I did know that my mother did not write notes on newspapers unless she was building a path through fear. A father who worked construction and took cash jobs when times were lean. A winter accident with no skid marks mentioned. A widow who moved with the quick economy of someone avoiding a shadow. A name circled 3 times in a house where nothing was done without a reason. I went through the rest of the box, careful, patient. There were more mentions of Rizzo scattered across months. A restaurant redevelopment on the east side with financing from a company no one had heard of 2 years earlier. A charity gala where the money raised never reached the listed foundation. A small photo of him in a tuxedo, smile, polite eyes, dark as bottle glass. In one article, a reporter hinted at ties between construction bids and companies with hidden owners. My father had worked crews all over the west side for years. I looked at the photo again and felt a tremor run through the old timber of the house. I checked the bottom of the box and found one more piece folded tight like a secret. It was a photocopy of a police brief dated the month before my father died. It mentioned a sting on stolen building materials that had fizzled when an informant stopped returning calls. The initials at the top were from a detective I had met once as a rookie in Austin, years later at a conference. It meant nothing, and it meant everything. Pieces of my father's world were touching pieces of a world I understood all too well. I kept the newspaper with the circled name on the desk and set the rest of the clippings back in the box. My mother's pencil rested in the bottom corner, sharpened to a short, stubborn point. I picked it up and held it between my fingers. It felt like holding her hand for a second, small and strong. I could see her at the kitchen table lamp on tea cooling, tracing a path through articles, building a private case. She had not told me because she wanted me safe or because she had promised someone she would keep quiet. Either way, the result was the same. I had lived a life built over a fault line that only she could see. The house seemed to lean in then. The refrigerator clicked and the sound carried down the hall. My eyes slid to the darkness at the end and the door that waited there. My mother had told me to open it only when there was nothing else left. Tonight felt like that kind of night. But I had spent years teaching rookies that you do not rush a room that might hold something hotter than your nerves. You gather your tools. You breathe. You step when the step is right. I folded the circled article and slid it into my pocket. I turned off the lamp and sat on the bed, hands on my knee, eyes adjusting to the dark. For a while, I just listened. The block was quiet now. A car passed, once tires whispering. Somewhere far off, a train sounded a horn, low and sad. I stood and walked to the doorway. From here, I could see the rectangle of pale hallway and the shadow the basement door cast on the floor. I stayed there until my heartbeat slowed and the line between memory and decision sharpened. Then I went to the kitchen for the flashlight I had seen under the sink. I tested it, and the beam cut a clean path across the linoleum. I set it on the counter and rested my palms beside it. The night had carried me from a father's face to a name circled 3 times. The next step was waiting at the end of the hall. I picked up the flashlight from the counter and felt its weight settle into my palm. I walked the hall with quiet steps and stopped at the door. My hand closed on the knob. I turned until the latch gave and then eased the door inward. The beam cut a white path through the dust. Wooden steps led down into a narrow room with low ceiling joists and concrete walls. I tested the first tread with my heel. It held. I went down slow, 1 step at a time, the light ahead of me, my free hand trailing the banister. When my foot found the slab, I paused and listened. I swept the beam across shelves lined with winter coats and plastic mason jars with buttons and nails boxes labeled with years in my mother's tidy hand. A pegboard held tools arranged with the neat logic she loved. I took the pry bar and laid it on the dryer, then moved the light again. Something about the back wall pulled at me. In the middle of the wall, a rectangle of it showed a faint difference in sheen. I stepped closer and ran my knuckles along the concrete. My fingers found the edge of a thin panel disguised with paint. I worked the flathead gently into the seam. The plaster crumbled in careful flakes. After a minute, the tip slipped behind the panel, and I levered it forward. Behind it, the beam fell on steel. A door flush with the studs. A dial with numbers that ran to 99. I leaned the panel aside and placed my palm on the steel. Cold and solid. The dial turned smooth under my fingers. I studied the face of it and felt the old training line up with instinct. A combination safe wants 3 numbers. She believed in neat patterns, in dates, in things that held meaning. I set the dial at 0, right to 7, left to 12, right to 71. I held my breath and pulled the handle. Then the mechanism clicked, and the door eased a fraction. I gripped and pulled. The smell that came out was a mix of paper and ink. Bundles of money lay in rows. I lifted one bundle and counted edges with my thumb. 10, 20, 2 shelves of it. A deeper shelf below. I whispered the total as the numbers rose. When I reached the end, the figure sat in my head heavy and unreal. 810,000. Behind the cash sat envelopes in a red accordion file. Each tab carried a name. Names that felt like aliases the moment I read them. Lydia Kane, Ruth Delgado, Ann Sawyer. There were Social Security cards tucked into clear sleeves, birth certificates from different counties, a passport with a photo that looked like my mother 10 years younger. I turned the passport over and saw stamps from places she had never told me she visited. On the lowest shelf, a thick paper envelope sat by itself. My name flowed across the front in my mother's script. I lifted the envelope like it might break and set it on the top of the safe door, where the light fell clean. My hands did not feel like mine as I slid a finger under the flap. Inside were several pages and a smaller sealed note with a phone number handwritten across its face. I put the smaller note aside and focused on the first sheet. The first line reached up and wrapped a hand around my throat. If you are reading this, it means you have nothing left to hold on to, and I am not there to hold you. She wrote that she had planned for this day the way she planned for winter. She wrote that the money was honest, money gathered from a settlement, and from years of careful living held in cash because banks leave trails. I turned the page and felt the pages rasp. The second line of the next sheet took my breath. She wrote that my father had not died in a spin of ice and bad luck on Route 2. She wrote that he had been taken from us by men whose names I would come to recognize, men who smiled in photographs and shook hands with officials, men who moved money through restaurants and construction companies, and who did not forgive debts or mistakes. She wrote that she had carried this truth in her bones, because telling me would have made me a target or a weapon, and she could not bear either. I closed my eyes and saw my father standing in the yard with sawdust in his hair. The story I had held for 27 years began to tear at the seams. Behind it, the shadow of something organized and patient slid into place with a logic that made me feel both sick and braced. I opened my eyes and read on. She wrote that after the funeral, a man she called a friend but did not name had told her a story different from the one in the paper. There had been pressure on my father from people tied to a name that had been printed in the metro section so many times the type looked worn. She did not write that name here. She had written it in a margin once. I reached into my pocket and felt the folded clipping there, the circle she drew around Salvatore Rizzo. She wrote that the safest path was to disappear inside a new life. She wrote that she learned how to work without leaving marks. She wrote that if one day the shadows from those years reached for me, then I should not try to fight them alone. She wrote that there was a person I could call, someone who had watched from a distance and who would know what steps to take if the worst came looking. I looked at the smaller sealed note and the number written there. My thumb ran over the digits. The name below the number was a man I did not know. I did not say it out loud. I went back to the longer letter and kept reading. She apologized for the silence. She said that keeping me in the dark had stained her days, but that she would do it the same way again if it meant I grew up standing in a light that did not draw fire. I set the page down and stepped back from the safe. My heart had settled into a strong, hard beat. I counted out loud to slow myself the way I used to before entering a room that could change a case. 1, 2, 3. Then I folded the letter back into its envelope and slid both into my jacket. I took one last look at the cash stacked like bricks. I looked at the passports and the names that were and were not my mother. I closed the safe door until the latch seated and nudged the false panel back into place. At the base of the stairs, I turned and swept the beam across the room one more time. Nothing else waited to be found. The smell of damp concrete and old cardboard pressed in again. I climbed the steps, each tread creaking the same note it had before. At the top, I closed the door and set the chain without thinking. In the kitchen, I set the flashlight on the table next to the envelope and the small note with the number. My hands trembled, then a delayed shake. Through the window over the sink, I could see a strip of night and the shadow of the maple. I poured a glass of water and drank it in 3 slow swallows. When I set the glass down, the simplest truth was lodged in my throat and finally slid free. My father had not died the way I had been told. My mother had kept me alive by turning our life into a held breath. The path forward was written in a stranger's name and a string of numbers in my mother's hand. I laid my palm over the paper and let the room be quiet while I listened to the sound of the choice waiting in it. I lifted the note with the number again and then set it aside so I could finish the letter. My mother's handwriting held steady even when the sentences did not. She began at the beginning she had never spoken. The winter after my father died, she was taken to a federal office where men and women asked for names and dates and faces. She told them what she had seen and what she had been warned not to say. The men responsible for my father's death were part of an organization that looked like family from the outside and felt like a vice when you stood inside it. She wrote that she saw the face of the man who made the decision that ended my father's life. She did not write his name in the letter. She had written it once already in graphite hard enough to shine on newsprint. In the spring of 1996, a marshal with soft eyes and a voice that did not carry gave her a packet and a set of instructions that were not threats, which was why she believed them. She kept Carter because it was already in the papers and would look less like a break. I was given Mercer so that anyone following the trail would hit a fork with no sign. She said a marshal explained that sometimes distance is measured in syllables as well as miles. Then the letter shifted, and I felt the room tilt with it. She wrote that people from those old days do not always come with guns. Some come with smiles and contracts and requests that sound polite until they do not. Years after we had settled in Cleveland, she began to hear that a name she recognized was dining in the same city with men who signed checks and shook hands at ribbon cuttings. The name spread into real estate deals and restaurants and construction bids. She wrote that the past had started to walk toward us again. She had reasons. A man watched the house from a car and wore a suit too heavy for spring. She hired a private investigator for a month, using cash from the settlement, and the investigator handed her a summary she never showed me. She wrote that sometime after I married Diana, doors began opening for my wife that did not open for others. Properties fell into her lap as if gravity had been reversed. A buyer with deep pockets requested only her. A bundle of pre-approved clients arrived after a lunch with a friend of a friend. The investigator told my mother to be careful. He said that when a man like Salvatore Rizzo wants to find you, he sends money first. If money does not work, he sends fear. If fear does not work, he sends both together. My mother did not accuse in the way that leaves no room for doubt. She left the sentence open because she loved me, and because she understood how easy it is to misread a marriage from the outside. She wrote that the timing was cruel in its precision. The whispers about me started not long after Diana closed her biggest deal. She wrote that she watched the pattern build and prayed she was wrong. When the divorce petition arrived at my door, with evidence that had my name written across it, in a hand that was mine but not, she stopped praying and started preparing. She said the money had one purpose. If I ever needed to stand up against a storm that looked bigger than a man, I would have enough ballast not to tip. She told me not to be ashamed to use it. Then she gave me the instruction the letter had been walking toward. Contact a marshal named Robert Kane. She wrote that he had been the one who guided her into that small office with the fluorescent lights and the promises she chose to trust. She told me to call him and tell him that the past had stepped back into our street. She told me to say my father's name out loud. She told me to listen when Kane told me what to do next. I set the page down. The house held still around me. I had built a life on a foundation that had been poured to protect me, not to tell me who I really was. I saw my childhood in a frame I had never used before. The moves that made no sense. The way my mother checked windows twice. The way our names did not match on school forms. I had lived inside a shell shaped like normal and never guessed where the seams were. I lifted the last page and read the final lines. She wrote that she was sorry for not telling me sooner. She said a day does not go by when she does not wish my father had stood on the porch one more time with his boots off and his laugh full. She said that I had become the kind of man he would have recognized in a lineup of 100, not by the face but by the way I stood up straight when it mattered. She asked me to be careful and brave in equal measure, and to remember that fear is only a tool if you hold it by the right end. I picked up the small note with the number. It said that if the number failed, there was a card in the back of the red file in the safe with another way to reach him. I took my phone from the table and laid it next to the note. I did not press call. I needed to breathe past the corner I had just turned. Every choice from here forward would leave a mark. I cupped my hands and drank until the taste of copper faded. I went to the living room and stood by the window. The street lay quiet under the last slip of night. I thought of Diana and the burner phone, and the smile she had given me in the courtroom. I thought of Rizzo and the circles my mother drew around his name until the paper bruised. I thought of the men I had arrested who pretended that stories were accidents, and the way they flinched when the evidence gave a different ending. I returned to the table and picked up the phone again. My mother had built this moment out of quiet years and thrift and a courage I had not understood until now. I sat down, set my feet flat on the linoleum, and let the silence expand until it felt like a room I could stand inside without falling through the floor. I dialed the number and a calm voice picked up. I said my name and that my mother had told me to call him if the past ever knocked on our door again. The man said he was Robert Kane and asked if I was in the house. He told me to touch nothing else, to lock the front door, and to wait. He said he would be at my address by early afternoon. I hung up and did exactly what he asked. I checked the front and back doors and slid the chain across the basement door again. I sat at the table as the hours stretched thin. Every sound outside felt amplified. A delivery truck idled a bus, let out its breath 2 blocks away. When a dark sedan slowed at the curb and a second car eased in behind it, my heart began to run hard. 3 people stepped out. 2 men, 1 woman. Suits cut for work, not display. I opened the door before they knocked. The lead man held his credentials low enough for me to see the seal and the name. Robert T. Kane. The woman and the other man did the same. They used first names only. Kane asked if anyone else had a key. I told him no and that the neighbors kept to themselves. Kane asked me to sit for a moment so he could walk through. I told him about the night in 1995, the move, the quiet years, the letter with my name. He listened without interrupting, and his eyes only shifted when I mentioned the name I had found circled in the newspaper. He asked to see the clipping. I handed it over. He looked at the circle my mother had pressed hard and nodded once. He asked to see the basement. I unlocked the chain and turned the knob. We went down together, my flashlight in my hand. At the back wall, I pulled the painted panel free and stepped aside. Kane studied the safe. He did not touch the money. He asked to see the file with the names and the passports. He asked if anyone else knew about the safe. I told him no, not even Diana. I turned the handle until the latch set and returned the false panel to its seat. Back in the kitchen, Kane took the chair opposite mine and said his office had been aware of this address since the day my mother died. He said the program kept a list of locations tied to people who had helped put dangerous men in front of grand juries. He said this house had drawn a certain low-level interest in recent years. I gave him the short version. 2 decades in homicide and major crimes. The slow bleed of a marriage that began with laughter and ended with court orders. The whisper in the courtroom. The rumor about gambling. He said men like Salvatore Rizzo do not always order blood. He said that in the last 10 years, people tied to that circle had learned that the best way to remove a witness is to leave that person upright and breathing with no job, no home, and no credibility left. He said, if the target finally reached for the past, the way I just had, then the net would tighten. He said there were indications that my wife had benefited from introductions connected to that circle. He said her rapid climb in the luxury market overlapped with the presence of a lender known to be a front for money that did not enjoy daylight. He said a man we would call an intermediary had been seen with Diana on several occasions. He slid a folder from his case and laid it flat between us. The first photo showed Diana outside a restaurant in Houston, head tilted, smile, polite, her phone in her hand. The second showed a man stepping into the frame, maybe 50, hair silver suit, the color of smoke. A name card in the corner identified him as Victor Mancini, an associate of associates. In another photo, Diana leaned toward him while he spoke. The next series showed her in a hotel lobby in Dallas, then at a coffee shop in Austin. None of the photos showed cash or envelopes or handshakes that meant more than hello. Each showed proximity and timing. Kane said the pictures were not enough. He said a judge would want bank trails, phone records, statements that could stand under cross-examination. He said they were working on that. He said I needed to understand the shape of the storm I was in so I would not make sudden moves that put my children at risk. I asked what I should do. He told me to stay put for 48 hours. He told me to contact no one I did not have to. He told me that his office would put a car at the end of the block. He told me that if Diana reached out, I was to be polite and vague and to offer no information. He said that grief speaks loud, and enemies love the sound. He asked about the money in the safe. I said it was mine now in the way that inheritance is both a gift and a burden. He asked me to write down the serial numbers of 3 bundles and then seal the safe and not open it again until he asked. We walked the perimeter of the house together. He asked about the locks and the sight lines. He told me to keep the porch light on all night because light is a message to people who prefer the dark. Before he left, he looked at me in a way that replaced the formal with something almost human. He said there would be times when the evidence would feel like it was taking too long to speak. The cars slid away, and the block went back to its small noises and its small silences. I stood in the doorway for a long minute, with the folder still on the table behind me. I closed the door and set the lock. I sat down and opened the folder again, even though I knew there was nothing new in it. The face of the man beside Diana held that polite blankness I had seen 100 times in interview rooms. The pictures did not prove what I wanted them to prove. I put the photos back in order and closed the folder. The clock in the kitchen kept its steady pace. I rested my elbows on the table and pressed my palms together and let my breath level out. I could feel the old side of myself wake up the part that looked for seams and listened to what was not said. I stared at the envelope with my mother's letter and at the phone beside it and told myself to hold the line until the next move announced itself. 2 days later, Rebecca Sloan parked at the curb in a dark sedan and walked up the path with her briefcase tight to her side. We sat at the kitchen table. She said we had movement. Rebecca said she had retained a forensic accountant and a former federal analyst on rush terms. She said they had followed a line of money that began in a lender connected to Victor Mancini and ended in an entity Diana managed for listing expenses. The transfers were thin and timed to pass as retainers and staging reimbursements. Then larger amounts landed the week before the petition was filed. Rebecca said money moved from a shell owned by a restaurant group that never served a single meal to a marketing firm. From there, it moved to a business credit card tied to Diana labeled for event costs and client entertainment. Keep my name out of it, and use the cash to build a case against me without smudging the fingerprints of the people who paid. Rebecca lifted her eyes and said there was more. A cooperating source had recorded a meeting in a bar near Memorial Park in Houston. The source had gone in with a wire. He sat 2 stools away from Diana and Victor Mancini, but he had turned over a file and signed a statement for chain of custody. Rebecca said I needed to hear a portion. Then Mancini spoke, voice low and easy. He said the paperwork had legs if we kept feeding it. He said neighbors were cheaper than experts, and they sounded better in court. Then Diana answered. Calm, businesslike, no hesitation. She said Frank would do what was asked if the numbers were right, and that the bank prints were already mocked to match. She said people see what they want to see. A judge will not dig if the stack is tall. I stopped the audio with my palm before I knew I had moved. The room seemed to tilt. Rebecca said, breathe, and pressed play again. The source shifted on his stool, and the mic caught the slide of fabric. Diana said the kids would believe her because they had to. She said a clean win in the first hearing would make appeals harder, because a man without resources or reputation rarely survives long enough to reach the second round. Mancini told her to keep the phone clean and to use only the black one for swing details. The burner from my garage. She said this was enough to move a judge to reconsider temporary orders if we were careful, but not enough to bring charges that would stick without more legs under them. We needed bank subpoenas and phone records and a warm body to say it to a court. I asked Rebecca if Diana was afraid. Was she being pushed? She said fear may have opened the door at first, or ambition, or both, but the voice on the tape did not belong to a hostage. It belonged to a partner. My phone buzzed. The screen showed Olivia. She said she was in Cleveland for a law clinic visit to the courthouse and wanted to talk. She was 5 minutes away. I told her to come by. I met Olivia at the porch. She climbed the steps with a backpack and a hard set to her jaw that reminded me of myself. She looked past me into the living room that she had last seen when she was 13. She said the place smelled like her grandmother, and that made her want to cry. I told her to come sit, and that someone from my legal team was here. Olivia began with the same line from her email, only softer. If you did nothing wrong, why is there so much proof? I told her evidence can be farmed like corn if you have enough land and time. Rebecca said we had begun to pull threads and some of the fabric was coming loose. Olivia looked between us and said she did not want talk about vague. She wanted one thing she could hold. The bar noise filled the kitchen. Olivia frowned, puzzled, and then we heard Diana speak. She stared at the screen. The words rolled on. Diana said the affidavit from Frank would land next week, and that she would handle the psychologist by sending over a packet that would prime the right words. She said the word compulsive as if she were trying it on. Olivia raised a hand. Turn it off. Rebecca stopped the audio. She asked where this came from and whether we had doctored it. Rebecca said the chain of custody was signed and would be shown to a judge under seal. Olivia looked at me. I did not say I told you so. I said I am sorry. She said she needed to step outside for a minute. The tape kept playing in my head. Diana saying our children would believe her because they had to. The marriage I had defended inside my own skull collapsed in a way no court order had managed. Rebecca spoke in a measured voice. She said the next steps were precise. We would file a motion to revisit temporary orders based on newly discovered evidence, attach a sworn declaration from me, attach a declaration from the accountant, and offer the recording under seal for in-camera review. We would request a protective order to prevent Diana from moving Jacob across state lines until a full hearing. We would flag the pattern of transfers and the presence of parties tied to Mancini. She would also contact Kane so that his office could coordinate the timing with whatever they had moving on their end. I asked what this would do to Olivia and Jacob. Rebecca said truth breaks and then it sets. She said it was better than living in a room painted with lies. I looked toward the porch where my daughter stood with her hands on the rail. I remembered telling her that sometimes sorry is a word people use when they need a break from themselves. Olivia came back in with her face set. She said she wanted copies of whatever the court would allow her to see, and that she would not speak to her mother until she had time to think. She said Jacob would need care when the floor shifted under him, and that I had better be ready to stand steady. I told her I would. She nodded once like a judge concluding a hearing. After she left, Olivia and I sat in the quiet. She asked if I believed her mother had loved us. I said I thought she had in her way, and that what she had done now did not erase who she had been, but it changed what came next. She said, "Do not do anything stupid." I said I would not. When she was gone, I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the wood. I looked at the laptop on the table and the envelope with my mother's script, and I felt something move in me that was not rage and not grief. It was the old engine from my years in a badge, the one that starts when a case stops being about paperwork and becomes about principle. I pulled a legal pad from the drawer and wrote the names we would need and the places we would press. The courthouse steps felt heavier than they had the first time. I paused for a moment at the base, staring at the columns that had already swallowed so much of my life. Rebecca was beside me, ready, but knowing the ground could shift under us at any second. I followed her in and into the same courtroom, where everything had been taken from me months before. Diana was already seated with her attorney, polished, and still her face unreadable. She didn't glance my way, not even once. I felt a pang deep in my chest at the sight of Olivia and Jacob together, both old enough now to measure the distance between truth and lies, but young enough to still be hurt by what they couldn't fully understand. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Mallory entered her black robe, brushing the wood as she climbed to the bench. We all rose, then sat again, as her gavel tapped once against the block. Rebecca stood and began. She outlined the purpose of the motion, framed it as newly discovered evidence that cut through the foundation of the prior ruling. Then she called her first witness. Frank Doyle. The side door opened and Frank shuffled in. He looked older than he had the last time I saw him at the neighborhood bar. His shoulders slumped, his tie crooked, his hands trembling as he clutched a folded piece of paper. He raised his hand and swore in his voice barely above a whisper. When he sat down, Rebecca approached slowly. "Mr. Doyle, last year, you signed a sworn statement regarding Mr. Mercer, did you not?" His voice cracked as he answered yes. Rebecca pressed, asking if those statements were true. He froze, his Adam's apple bobbing. The silence stretched until the judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Frank cleared his throat. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "They weren't true." The words landed in the room like a thunderclap. Rebecca didn't let the pause linger. She asked why. Frank's eyes darted toward Diana before he looked down at his shoes. He said he had been paid. Cash. Enough to cover debts that had been chasing him for years. He admitted Diana had been the one who approached him, that she promised it would be quick, painless, and no one would ever trace it back. She had told him Jonathan was hiding things, that she needed someone who could vouch for what everyone already suspected. Frank swallowed hard and said he thought it would never see the light of day, that it was just paper, nothing more. Until now. Diana's lawyer jumped up, objecting, calling Frank unreliable, claiming he had a history of drinking and bad decisions. The judge held up a hand, overruled, and let the testimony stand. I saw a flicker in Diana's eyes, then a crack in the mask she had worn so tightly. Rebecca moved next to the financial exhibits. Transfers from accounts tied to shell corporations, invoices from businesses that didn't exist. Each slide drew the net tighter, showing how money flowed from Victor Mancini's network straight into Diana's control. The threads pulled together, neat and undeniable. I felt the burn of humiliation and rage in equal measure. This was how she had destroyed me, dollar by dollar, lie by lie. Then Rebecca played the audio. The low hum of a bar glasses clinking, Mancini's voice, first smooth and practiced. He spoke about affidavits and judges, about how neighbors sounded better than experts. And then came Diana's voice. Clear, unmistakable. She talked about Frank delivering his affidavit, about coaching a psychologist, with documents that would prime the right language. She laughed softly when Mancini mentioned the casino receipts, said people see what they want to see, judges most of all. And then she said the words that cut deepest. The kids will believe me because they have to. I felt my jaw tighten, every muscle in my neck drawn taut. Across the room, Jacob's face drained of color. His fists clenched, knuckles white. Olivia stared forward, unblinking. The audio ended, and silence fell so heavy I could hear the sound of my own pulse. Then Olivia stood. She didn't look at the judge, didn't ask for permission. She just stood and spoke, her voice carrying across the chamber, with a strength I had only ever heard once before when she argued her way into her first law internship. She said her father was not the man described in those lies. She said she had doubted him because evidence was supposed to mean truth, but she had learned that even evidence could be poisoned. She said the reason she chose law was because of him, because she had grown up watching him fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Her voice cracked, but she held it steady. "He is not guilty," she said. "He is my father." My throat closed, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I looked at her, a daughter, and saw the child she had been, and the woman she was becoming, standing there with fire in her eyes. The courtroom held its breath. The judge allowed her words to hang before finally raising a hand for order. But nothing could erase what Olivia had said. Not for me. Not for Jacob. Not for Diana. Judge Mallory leaned forward, her voice calm but edged with finality. She said the evidence presented, the testimony given, and the recordings admitted under seal made clear that the prior ruling had been built on fraudulent ground. The temporary orders were vacated. The allegations of gambling and misconduct could not stand. Custody arrangements would be reviewed anew, with consideration of the children's best interests and the fraud exposed. My professional record, stripped months before, was to be restored pending formal reinstatement by the state board. Then he struck the gavel, once sharp, decisive. I exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding for over a year. Jacob shot up from his seat, barreled past the bailiff, and threw himself into my arms. His sobs racked through him, raw and unfiltered, and I held him tight, my hand on the back of his head. I closed my eyes, letting his tears soak into my shirt, and for the first time since all this began, I felt whole. Olivia stood near us, tears brimming in her eyes, but her chin lifted, proud, unshaken. Across the room, Diana sat motionless. Her lawyer whispered in her ear, but she didn't move. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Fear had cracked through her mask, and for the first time I saw it plainly. She wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but she knew what was coming. She knew the walls were closing, that the foundation she had built on lies was crumbling beneath her feet. When the gavel fell again for adjournment, I rose with my children at my side. The weight that had been pressing me into the ground had lifted, not fully, but enough to let me breathe again. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and Diana knew it as well as I did. The morning after the ruling, I woke before dawn to the sound of my phone buzzing across the table. Robert Kane said warrants were moving. He told me to stay inside, keep the porch light on, and let the day run its course. An unmarked sedan idled at the corner, 2 figures inside facing forward, hands quiet on their laps. At 8:15, the first text came from Rebecca. Indictments unsealed. Then another. Coordinated arrests underway in Texas and Ohio. By mid-morning, the crawl at the bottom of the local station carried names I knew too well. A federal grand jury had returned charges against Salvatore Rizzo and several associates for racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. The footage showed a convoy outside a glass tower in Houston, jackets with bold lettering, moving through a revolving door, a man in a suit that cost more than my car, raising his hands as agents took his wrists. Kane arrived at my door around noon. He said Rizzo was in federal custody and would be transported to the courthouse for arraignment that afternoon. He said Victor Mancini had been picked up at a condo near the Galleria, without incident phone in his hand, 3 steps toward the balcony when the door opened. He said a small team had served the warrant in Austin at Diana's brokerage, where she had been meeting a client with brochures laid out like playing cards. He told me I would be notified when she made her first appearance. Olivia called between clinic meetings. She said she had been allowed to assist a federal team with document review as part of her program, that she would be on a short leash, and that she wanted to do something that mattered. I told her to be careful and to rest when she could. Jacob came into the kitchen with his gym bag over his shoulder. He said the coach had texted and that the team wanted him back for afternoon drills. I told him to go hit the field and run until his lungs felt clean. He smiled, and then he was out the door. Just after 3, I got a call from Rebecca. The state licensing board had voted to restore my professional standing. The stigma that had hung like smoke over my name was cut in half. I printed the letter and set it on the fridge under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse my mother had loved. At 4:30, I stepped into the hallway of the federal courthouse with Kane at my side. We took a bench outside the arraignment room and waited. Doors opened. A marshal led a group past. Rizzo walked among them, hands in front cuffs bright against a suit that suddenly looked ill-fitting. Only a tired sense that gravity had finally found what it had been reaching for. Diana's appearance was set in the smaller courtroom down the hall. I told myself I did not need to be there. Then I stood anyway when the door opened. The chain at her wrists was spare and efficient. She did not scan the room for me, and I did not call to her. I watched her take the short walk to the defense table and place her hands flat on the wood as if the grain could steady her. Her counsel whispered in her ear. She stared at the bench. The magistrate read rights and set conditions. The government argued risk of flight and risk of obstruction. The defense argued roots in the community and a spotless record if you ignored the last few months. The room weighed those words and came down where I expected. Remand pending hearing. The order landed, and in the silence after I felt an old reflex lift in me. Back home at dusk, the porch light threw a circle on the steps. The sedan at the corner slid away to refuel, and another took its place. Olivia arrived late, hair pulled back, eyes ringed with fatigue that had not had time to settle. She said the team had found overlapping ledgers that would support the money trail, and that a custodial witness had flipped in exchange for protection. I made pasta, and we ate at the small table while Jacob recounted a route he ran clean for the first time in months. The next morning, the chief from my old department called. He said the board had sent word and that a letter of correction would go in my personnel file. He offered a coffee when I was back in Austin and did not say anything about returning to duty. He thanked me for how I had carried myself when the tide ran the other way. I thanked him for making the call himself. 2 days later, Kane asked if I wanted to attend a brief status conference. He said it would be uneventful, but sometimes quiet changes are worth seeing with your own eyes. We stood in the back of the room as counsel discussed schedules and protective orders. The judge set dates and reminded both sides that discovery without grandstanding is still discovery. He said he was sorry without raising his eyes. He said he had made a coward's bargain and that he was trying to find a way to pay back what he had taken. I told him to stay sober and tell the truth to anyone who asked. He nodded, hands twisting, and moved away. The week stretched into a new pattern. Mornings at the house with coffee and lists. Afternoons at fields and offices, paperwork and calls, a life repaired in increments. Olivia split time between her clinic and the federal team, coming home with a mind too full to sleep. Jacob rose early to lift with his teammates and came back smelling of grass and effort. Some offered casseroles, some offered silence. When the day came to move Diana from the holding unit to the county facility, I stood where visitors stand behind a line on the floor worn by other waiting shoes. Metal clanged and a door slid, and I saw her through the narrow glass. She stood behind a set of bars that looked more theatrical than necessary, hands clasped chin up. I felt the edge of anger, and then I felt it dull. Only people do. No words. No performance. I thought of Olivia's voice in the courtroom, and Jacob's head pressed into my chest, and my mother's letter folded in my jacket, like a map that had led me through a storm. I thought of the man who had ordered my father's end, and the years that choice had stolen from us without firing another shot. A guard touched my elbow and told me my time was up. I stepped back. Diana did not move. That night, Olivia spread case notes across the table, and Jacob fell asleep on the couch with a playbook open on his stomach. I stood in the kitchen with the porch door cracked and the lake wind finding its way through the screens. In the quiet between the refrigerator cycling off and the clock marking the next minute, I realized the noise in my head had changed. It no longer sounded like defense. It sounded like the steady work of putting one brick on another until the wall holds. Olivia had already left for the clinic, a travel mug in her hand and a stack of case notes tucked under her arm. Jacob had jogged out with his cleats slapping against the porch boards, the easy grin of a kid who had found his way back to a team. I walked the narrow hall toward the door at the end. I stopped with my hand on the knob and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. For a moment I saw my father, as he had been before everything bent out of shape, sawdust in his hair, a laugh filling the kitchen. I saw my mother bent over a book at the table, pencil poised, the quiet strength of a woman who had carried 2 lives through a storm. Then I turned the lock and eased the door open. I stood at the top of the steps without moving. I did not need to go down. I had seen what I needed to see, had taken what I needed to take, a letter, a number, the truth that had been waiting in the dark. The money would sit where it was until the government finished its work, and the last forms were filed, and the last signatures dried. I would use it for what my mother intended. Stability. Tuition. Give the kids a runway long enough to take off without looking back. I told her I had opened the door and it had saved me. I told her the lies were broken and the people who built them were facing what they earned. I told her I had stood in a courtroom and heard my daughter say I was the reason she studied law. I told her Jacob had run routes until the field itself seemed to carry him. I thanked her for the plan she had made in pencil and for the years she had kept her fear as quiet as a turned page. I closed the door and set the chain. The urge to lock it with something permanent eased as I stood there. The door did not need a ceremony. It needed a decision. I turned away and let the hallway fill with ordinary light. The rest of the day moved like any other day, and also like no day I had known for a long time. I called Rebecca to confirm filings and dates. The board sent a formal notice that my record was clean. Kane checked in from a conference room, where men with tired eyes and quiet voices arranged calendars that would stretch into next year. He said Rizzo's team had tried to find an angle and run it, and found the corners tighter than they expected. He thanked me for staying steady. I told him the steadiness belonged to a woman who had folded a letter and put it where her son would find it when he was finally ready to read. I stood outside the old library branch while a summer rain came down in a soft sheet. The building looked smaller than it had when I was a boy. I could see a librarian shelving new arrivals in careful order. My mother had shelved the same way. I thought about the years she had worked here with a name that was not hers, in a city that asked no questions if you showed up and did the job. I thought about the people who spend their lives building small, safe harbors and ask for nothing louder than a thank you on the way out. When the rain let up, I cut across the street and walked home. Jacob texted that practice had gone long and he would grab a burger with the line and be home later. Olivia sent a photo of a casebook with sticky notes and a message that read, "Tired but moving." I set my phone down and let a smile rise without pulling it back. In the late afternoon, I drove to the county facility because there was one thing left to do. A guard buzzed me through to a narrow room with glass and phones on each side. I stood without sitting. A door opened and Diana stepped into view. She took the seat across the glass and did not reach for the phone. I did not reach either. We looked at each other through the sheet of thick plastic that might as well have been years. I had expected anger to come up from the floor like heat in August. Instead, I felt something flatter, a clean edge. Not mercy, not satisfaction. A simple recognition of what was. We had built a life together with good bricks and bad mortar, and when a man offered her a faster path, she took it, and the house fell. I did not forgive and I did not damn. I let the truth sit between us. Her eyes flicked once a small question that belonged to another time. I shook my head, almost a smile, and saw her understand there would be no more courtroom speeches from either of us. A guard touched her shoulder and she rose. For a second, she hesitated. Then she turned and was gone. Olivia arrived with her hair pulled into a quick knot and a legal pad full of scribbles. We ate with the screens open to the lake breeze, and Jacob burst in near the end, loud and happy, a streak of cleat dust across his calf. He told the story of a play he had broken open, and Olivia told him not to talk with his mouth full. I sat back with my plate and watched them knock against each other without sharp edges. This was the quiet heart of the thing my mother had wanted to save. After the dishes, after Olivia's notes were stacked, and Jacob's bag was at the door, I walked to the living room and opened the cabinet where I had tucked the envelope. I unfolded the letter and let my eyes run the familiar path of those lines. I reached the end and felt the same steadying I felt the first time. Then I folded it up again and set it back where it belonged. I turned off the lamp and let the room hold its evening shadows. Before bed, I returned to the hall and laid my fingers on the basement door one last time. In a low voice, I told my mother that I had opened it and that it had saved me. I told her I was closing it now for good. I told her that the truth can break you, but it can also put you back together in a shape that fits the life you are meant to carry. I stood until the house settled, and then I walked away. Later, I lay awake for a few minutes with the window cracked. I thought about the men who had tried to shape my story with paper and fear. I thought about the way the tide had turned, not with a shout, but with a quiet accumulation of facts and the refusal to let lies speak last. I thought about my father, my mother, my children, and the line that runs through us whether we see it or not. Sometimes losing everything is not an ending. Sometimes it is a door that opens onto a room you were supposed to find all along. The truth hurts. The truth heals. It sets a person free in the only way that matters. If this story found you at a time when your own family keeps secrets, I hope you share your story when you are ready, because light lives in those moments. If the journey meant something to you, hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you are here when the next story arrives. Then get some rest. Tomorrow is work again, one brick at a time until the wall holds.